Good afternoon, Nova Nation. Happy Sunday, and welcome here to a special edition of Villanova Sports Talk here on WXVU. David Szczepanski alongside Stephen Cain. Steve, our second special episode in the past month. We have a new head coach here on the main line, Kevin Willard. I'm sure most people have heard the news. If you hadn't, the former Maryland head coach, Kevin Willard, is now a Villanova Wildcat. So a lot to discuss. But Steve, first of all, how are you doing, and initial reactions to the big news that broke this morning around 1 o'clock a.m. So I know you were probably staying up late. I was asleep, I'll be honest. But we're now about 12 hours into Kevin Willard officially being the head coach of Villanova basketball.
Yeah, David, I'm doing good, and today's a really big day, and we'll get into it, all the ramifications of this decision. I'm proud of, and again, we'll get to all this, but Eric Rodell, the athletic director, and everyone that was involved conducting and we talked about this before when Coach Neptune was fired, and we had the special episode a couple weeks ago on Villanova Sports Talk, that this would be the first time really ever that Villanova conducts an outside national coaching search, and that can be really difficult at times, doing something new and going through all the candidates, and you have to move quickly, especially in the age of college sports now, with the transfer portal opening on Monday, this past Monday, after the first couple rounds of March Madness. So they needed to get a deal done pretty quickly, and I'm happy that they did so. And Kevin Willard, again, someone who's very experienced. We'll talk about, again, what he really brings to the table. I think defensively, he's one of the best minds out there that you could get, especially since the defense did struggle for Villanova this past season. Again, the team will look a lot different. Villanova will work a lot in the portal. But just to sum it up, I'm very excited. Change needed to be made, and I think this is the first step to doing that.
Well, we said, a couple weeks ago that this was a very crucial spot in Villanova's program moving forward, not just for this upcoming season, but possibly for the next decade. And I think Villanova, they did a tremendous job. I think they got the right guy. Every coach has their baggage. There's pros and cons to every single coach, as we discussed on our list a couple weeks ago, and Dominic and I did throughout the past month or so. We'll talk about the reason why people are skeptical about Kevin Willard, which I think is important to acknowledge. But like you said, Steve, I mean, he is a really good head coach. He's been the head coach of Maryland since 2022. He led them to 2 NCAA tournament runs. Of course, most recently, and really his best tournament run as a head coach was going to the Sweet 16 before being eliminated a couple days ago. But he's done a lot of good things with the program. And the year where he didn't do all that well was last season, when Villanova and Maryland had matched up at the Finn. Their defense was really good. The offense just really struggled. But I don't think that was necessarily the fault of Kevin Willard. We'll really, continue to break down things. But first, do want to give some credit here. The news was first broken by Jeff Ehrman of Inside Maryland Sports. Broke it at 12:57 a.m. Put out a tweet. Kevin Willard is Villanova bound after leading the Terps to the Sweet 16, but finishing with an odd saga of public hints at his impending exit. He leaves UMD needing a quick replacement and likely a depleted roster. And I guess this is the time, right, for Kevin Willard where, you think about, Derek Queen and how good he was. I know that he's getting NBA draft attention, and so are a lot of the other players on that team. I know there's been rumors about players, potentially transferring, so this might have been the right time for him. But, Steve, how this all kind of started was, we were talking about on Villanova Sports Talk last week, Willard had a press conference, right before March Madness had officially started and Maryland went on their run, where he basically said that he wasn't happy in Maryland, that they, didn't give enough resources. Now, he actually, mainly his words had stuck to that he wanted more resources for the basketball program. He didn't think that they were getting enough compared to the rest that Maryland was spending. But, really what this came down to, he wasn't happy. He wanted more money on his own contract. He wanted more leverage in negotiations for the program. And, really, in the very beginning of this saga, when, a lot of people were starting to connect Willard to Villanova, I genuinely thought that it wasn't going to happen. I think I even said that on the show, because of the fact that I thought he was using Villanova as an opportunity to get leverage of what he wanted. It was a spot that, a lot of people saw him could fit well. He knew that there were rumors on social media, and he was also at the point where, his contract, like you said, he wanted more money. He wanted more money for the program, wanted the Maryland, athletic department to pay more attention to basketball with, of course, their run this season. But I think as time continued to go on over the next, couple weeks, and as Maryland continued to play in the tournament, his focus was, I'm sure mainly on Maryland and getting ready for those games. But also, I think it became more of a reality for him that Villanova was this opportunity that he could seek. And, once some of the coaching names came off the board, like Ryan Odom going to UVA, Pitino a couple days ago went to Xavier, I think as time continued to drag on, Willard, saw this as really an opportunity for him. And you saw, the fan base in Maryland really begin to turn on him. And, you could argue that it was for somewhat of a right reason, considering some of his comments that were very, passive-aggressive about leaving Maryland. But also, with that being said, I think there were a lot of different factors that played a role in this maybe starting as something that was a possibility but not likely into something that was a real deal for him. And, last night it became official. I think for the past couple of days, it was, especially when Pitino went to Xavier, it was, we don't want to say 100%, but it was in the 90s that Kevin Willard was going to become the next head coach of Villanova. There really wasn't any other names out there. Villanova had let this national search, as you said, Steve, going on for a long time. And they got to a point where Willard was kind of the guy, and you could argue that maybe pushing all your marbles in on one guy was not exactly great if he had said no and decided to stay at Maryland. But Villanova gets their guy, and like I said, I mean, there's baggage with Willard. We'll talk about that over the next hour that we're here on Villanova Sports Talk. But overall, I think it's a really good hire for Villanova, a program that was looking for a coach with plenty of experience. He has that. He was the coach for Seton Hall for a decade. Had experience at Maryland, begun his career as an assistant in the NBA. So the coaching experience is there. He's had some success in March Madness, 4-7 in the NCAA tournament. I know that his first his deepest run was the Sweet 16 run, and you could argue that Derek Queen and Julian Reese and some of the other players in Maryland really pushed him there. But when you look at Maryland and the program, considering over the last decade, he led them to their best season. So I think there's something to be said about that. He's a guy that's had success recently, and I think this is a good hire.
Yeah, I would think so too. I think it is the right call. And to touch on what you were saying about the economics of the decision, it makes a lot of sense because it's not even just now that Kevin Willard is talking about the fact that he had to compete with a football program, with Maryland being in the Big Ten, one of the top two conferences in college football, and then that kind of leads basketball kind of kicked to the side. But even just in the long term, or even in just kind of the immediate future, like there's this push in the next few years. There's a bill that maybe passed, House versus NCAA, and if that's passed, that would lead to my understanding, NIL would work like this, where you'd have revenue sharing between each of the teams, and that would just make the disparity between, like, say, take a program like Maryland, for example. People think, and again, it's early, but 75% of the funding, the overall pot of money, would go to football, and then a good amount would go to basketball. Basketball's kind of next in the pecking order, and then the rest of the sports, they kind of just have to divvy it up among themselves. So, and part of his concern was that he didn't want basically the basketball program to kind of get left behind, right? Football, it's the most popular sport both professionally and collegiately, and he realized, and I think he had a point as well, because again, the Maryland football program, again, the Villanova football team played against them and they destroyed us, but they've struggled a lot, and this Maryland team had a really good season. Compare that to the football program. Like, the basketball program did a lot better than the football program, and he sees the writing on the wall that in a couple years that bill will probably get passed and more money will just get funneled into the football program, which hasn't done that well. Meanwhile, Maryland, the basketball team, seems like it's kind of on the up and up, and he realized, again, with the Big East, that doesn't focus on football. Basketball is kind of more the main thing. This revenue sharing thing goes into place in a couple years. Villanova, it's no secret, it's a basketball school, and a lot of those resources would be put in. A lot of that money, the pretty big NIL fund for Villanova, would go into men's basketball, and Kevin Willard saw that and said, I'm probably going to take that job. And historically, it is still a better job. Villanova, it's no secret, they've fallen on hard times the past few years, missing the tournament 3 straight years, but still 3 national championships, a lot of history, more so than Maryland. Maryland did have some good teams in like the early 2000s, but they've struggled a lot recently. They're not a blue blood. Villanova still is a blue blood, again, even though it's been tough the past few years. So the history and the economics really made sense for Kevin Willard. But again, how he handled the whole thing, I mean, we'll talk about that more and some of the baggage, but I think economically and historically it made a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I had the opportunity to be in the DMV, Washington, a few times this past month, and you could really see that the University of Maryland had captured people in that area. Let's face it, I mean, Washington doesn't have great sports teams right now, especially, professional leagues. The Nationals are not very good.
Yeah, besides the Commanders,
and the Capitals. So I shouldn't say not very good, but during this time of year in the winter, after football season ends, when you get to that March to kind of, until football season starts, because the Commanders did have a good year last year, you have the Capitals, but I mean, the Wizards, the Nationals are not very good.
Yeah.
And at this time of year, when you have March Madness going on, in the spring, the University of Maryland, this season have really kind of captured a lot of people in that area, and you could see what was going on. There was a lot of, Maryland merch. And the basketball program did very well for the Terrapins this year and over the past couple of years under Coach Willard. So I think that, Maryland as a school missed out, because I really think this was an opportunity for them to cement themselves as, a top basketball program. I know that, keeping your standard, especially like you said, Steve, for a team that historically has not been super amazing, can be difficult. And also, like you said, Steve, I put out on Twitter, I thought that was very well said, that, it is, I don't want to say it's a 50-50 split, it's not, but it's closer to a 50-50 split between Maryland football and Maryland basketball than it is here at Villanova. A majority of the funds that, are spent here, the NIL money, a majority of the money goes to men's basketball here at Villanova.
Yeah.
That is not the case at Maryland. And this gives Coach Willard the opportunity to not only lead a top program in college basketball, but to lead the top program in terms of revenue, in terms of the money that the school spends at a school like Villanova compared to a school like Maryland, where he, per se, is fighting for competition with the football program, even though Maryland football, when you look at the competition against FBS schools, has not been good for some time. So this is a good opportunity for him. I think it's a good opportunity for Villanova. Like I said, I think it was very important to find a coach who has had success. He's a 335 overall win coach in his career. 335 to 249 is his record. Wins 57% of the games that he coaches. And I know there's a lot of people out there that are going to say that he didn't have the best record in the NCAA tournament, and that's not wrong. He's 4-7 when you look at his 11 games.
Yeah.
But what I will say is that I think people are also losing track that it is hard to win in March Madness. You can have some really good teams, and you see, I know that it wasn't so much this year. There wasn't a whole lot of upsets in the bracket this year, but where you see, high-seeded teams, suffer losses. You know what I mean? Where the number 1 seed, number 2 seed, it wasn't so much this year. It suffered losses to some teams that just barely made March Madness. It's tough to win. It's tough to win championships, and not to make excuses for Coach Willard, but I think that he has done a pretty solid job. When you look at his coaching career, like I said earlier, started as an assistant in 1997 with the Boston Celtics. Then he went from 2001 to 2007 as an assistant at Louisville. That was his first kind of college experience as a coach, before going to Iona for 3 seasons, Seton Hall, which is where he's most notably known, which I also think is why some people that have followed the Big East for a while, that have been Villanova fans for a long time, may not love the hire just because of that rivalry there with Seton Hall, but he was the coach there for 12 years in the 2022. Then, of course, Maryland for the past 3 seasons. And, Steve, what I will mention here is we looked at a lot of head coaches during the coaching search when you and I were on the air, when Dominic and I were on the air last week. And, take example of Porter Moser, who has had some success in his career, but it's been a long time since he's had that success. You have to go back to those Loyola teams, and he wasn't very successful with Oklahoma. Then we get a guy like Chris Collins, who's had some success in Northwestern, but hasn't had a chance with a top program. Ryan Odom has been successful at, VCU. They had a good run this year, and he's taken a program that didn't have a whole lot of attention to it to, making some noise in the March Madness. But you look at a guy like Kevin Willard that has really had success at every stop that he's went to, some sort of success. I mean, you look at Iona, when he first started in 2007 and the 2008 seasons, those teams were terrible. They won 12 overall games. They won less than 10 games in the MAAC conference, right? But then in 2009, his last year with Iona, they win 21 games. They win 9 more games than they did the 2 previous seasons. They finish 3rd in the conference with 12 conference wins, right? So his last year before Iona, he takes them to at least have some standing. Then you look at what he did at Seton Hall. When he first took over his first season, 2010, the Pirates were 13-17. 2011, he took them to the NIT when that was a bigger thing than it is now. In the second round, they won 21 overall games, and they had a losing record in conference play, and that went on for a couple years. But then you saw before he left Seton Hall, they won 20-plus games in 6 of the last 7 seasons that he was a head coach as the Pirates. They won 25 games in 2015, 21 games in 2016, 22 games in 2017, 20 wins in 2018, 21 wins in 2019, where they also had won or led the conference, the Big East, until COVID had hit in 2019, 2020. And then in 2021, 2022, his last year at Seton Hall, he was 21-11 with an 11-8 record in conference play. And he made the NCAA tournament. Made the NCAA tournament with Seton Hall 5 times. He would have made it 6 in his last 7 years at Seton Hall if the tournament wasn't canceled due to COVID.
Yeah.
And then you look at Maryland, his first year, taking over that program, and Maryland had kind of had hit a high, then it was on a little bit of a low, and then it picked up again right before Willard had taken over. But he had 22 wins in his first year, Steve, at Maryland, made the tournament, went to the round of 32, and last year was a tough year, let's face it. But then he rebounded nicely this year, had Maryland's best season in about a decade since 2015, had 27 wins, was 14-6 in conference play in a really tough conference, and was tied for second, was ranked in the top 15 in the top AP poll for a long time this season, made it to the Sweet 16, had some really good talent, unfortunately, ran up against some really good teams in March Madness. But, when it's all said and done, I mean, he's had success at every single stop that he's been at, and I think that shows that he's a really good head coach. I have to believe that, other teams, I know that, we're kind of later on now in the coaching search. I mean, Villanova, I'm sure was tied to him as he was for some time. But, I'm sure that other teams would have loved to have Kevin Willard. So that's my thoughts here is, he's had success at every single stop. So the other coaching candidates we talked about are either really on the younger side of things, having their first taste of success, or other coaches that maybe haven't had consistent success. But Kevin Willard is kind of the exception to that. And in addition to the success that he's had, Steve, he's only 49 years old. So he's still, I think...
a little older than Neptune.
Yeah, he's a little
still,
older than Neptune. But the
young.
reason why I bring that up is because I think in this age of college basketball, with, the amount of recruiting that has to be done and just how the transfer portal has really kind of changed the landscape. And, with the House settlement coming up, we'll see how that continues to shape things. But you do want to have a coach on the younger side of things. And, when it's all said and done, Willard is still only 49. He's a New York native. He gets to come somewhat closer to home than where he was at Maryland. So I think this is a really good hire for Villanova. And I'm happy that, they had the coaching search. It seemed like that they were involved with many different candidates and talking with them. And Willard's, just based off of, the time frame that it took and based off how everything went down, it seems like that Willard was Villanova's top option, and they were able to get him.
Yeah. That's what a lot of the reports were saying, that Willard was the top guy for a while, and you mentioned it, that Villanova and Willard, they were probably tied to the hip maybe a little bit sooner than when the news broke late last night. So credit to Villanova again for getting the guy that they really wanted. Again, there were talks about Richard Pitino at the time earlier this week. People thought that he was coming to the main line. He was going to be that main coach. Donovan Dent, the All-American, was going to come over. But again, Villanova, I agree with you. I think they wanted Willard all along, and credit to them for getting their guy. And he talked about the success at a lot of different programs. People talk about, again, with how great St. John's and Rick Pitino have been this year, and people just look back at Rick Pitino's coaching career and the fact that, again, he rebuilt St. John's, and then he rebuilt Iona. He had success in Kentucky and Louisville and all these places. Really, besides the NBA, just super successful. And Willard kind of has that similar comparison. And Willard actually, he started out before he became a head coach, before he started at Iona and then did Seton Hall in Maryland, he was actually an assistant under Rick Pitino, both under the Boston Celtics, that coaching staff, and then he actually followed Pitino to Louisville. And I remember we talked a lot about Richard Pitino a couple weeks ago when we were initially throwing out names for who would the replacement be for Coach Neptune, and we talked about how it'd be cool to have somebody, again, Richard Pitino, ton of influence from Rick Pitino, one of the best coaches ever, and you're not getting a Pitino, but you're getting a Willard, somebody who's kind of part of that Pitino coaching tree. And you see a lot of that in the defense, and I mentioned it at the top of the show. The defense was excellent this year, and this year was amazing. Analytically, the best team that Maryland's had in 10 plus years, 5th in defensive efficiency. They were a top 10 team by Ken Pom, Bart Torvik, really any analytics site that you look at. And you go back through the years. These are Kevin Willard coach teams. So the last 2 years before this year at Maryland, they were 17th, 39th in adjusted defensive efficiency, and then Seton Hall, read some off, 32nd in 2022, 51st in 2021, 31st in 2020, 61st, like all comfortably in the top 100. And again, that's something that Villanova really needed this season. The offense, again, we talked about it a good amount. It struggled in the late game situations, but by and large, through most games, you had efficient scores with Dixon and Poplar. And you're going to have a new team, I understand it, but just to bring a different defensive philosophy that can also force a decent amount of turnovers. The past 2 years, even the year that Maryland really struggled, they were top 70 in turnover rate forced, and they were top 40 this year, which makes sense. They were excellent. They were a really good team, the best team that Kevin Willard has had. You could really argue again, and you mentioned the 2020 year. I think he kind of got robbed. Seton Hall got robbed. You had Miles Powell, an All-American, a really great team. That probably would have made it out the first weekend. They could have made a deep run. 2016, going back when they beat Villanova in the Big East Tournament Championship, that was a really good team. They had a top 20, top 10 defense. So you're excited about what he brings, especially on the interior. A lot of solid interior defense. The interior defense for Villanova struggled a lot. So I think a lot to like for Kevin Willard, again, stylistically. And again, and generally keeping, again, the two out of the past 3 years also not shooting yourself in the foot and turning the ball over when you have the ball. I think that's big because Villanova's been good at that. So you're not going to have a drop off there when bringing in Kevin Willard to the main line. So very excited. And they also played a lot faster. Kevin Willard, usually more of a methodical coach, but this year, top 60 in tempo. I think Villanova will try to continue to play slow, and that's fine. But again, we talked about it a lot. That can open yourself up to games that have a little bit more variance because there's less possessions. But again, playing faster, you see teams like Alabama, right? They play super fast, and just it gives you so many more opportunities to score. It would be nice, again, to have a coach in Willard that maybe doesn't play super fast possession to possession, but can just push the tempo a little bit more when needed. So those are just some things, again, that stood out to me, especially with this year. The Crab Five, it was a really great team, and maybe some of those guys come over. Jacoby Gillespie, Rodney Rice, potentially could come over in the portal. Maybe you get one of them, maybe you get both, maybe you get neither, but they were that was a really solid backcourt for Maryland. So you like a lot with Coach Willard, I think, in general.
I agree, Steve. I completely agree. I think that I have been more pessimistic about the way the Villanova's offense performed than I think a lot of people this year.
Yeah,
I think especially down the stretch, I was very disappointed with the way that their offense had performed. With that being said, there were a lot of games this year where their defense had cost them games also down the stretch.
Yeah.
And I think that what Villanova did in the offseason was throughout this national search, I think they also kind of kept an eye on the Big East trends. And I know that St. John's did not go far in the tournament. But that being said, they were a really good team against Big East, caliber, Big East competition. They won, the Big East Conference in the regular season. They won the Big East tournament. And how did they get there? Defense. And, you have to find a way to shoot the ball better than St. John's did. You can't shoot 29% on the year and make it all that far, especially, in the NCAA tournament, just with how the game has kind of evolved with better three-point shooters and better three-point shooting teams. But that being said, I think Villanova's really put an emphasis on defense because that's what the Big East is. You have a good amount of teams that can score and at least find ways to get above that 70-point threshold. But what it really comes down to is defense. And Villanova, when you look at their biggest wins over the past 3 years when you were under Coach Neptune, all of them came with really good defensive performances. There weren't really, at least off the top of my head that I can think of, Steve, there was a shootout game where just the offense came through and was able to shoot the lights out. And even though the opponent shot well, Villanova just pulled away in the end. Pretty much all their big wins against top teams, UConn, St. John's, even that win against, I guess that the exception would be the win against UNC in the Battle for Atlantis tournament.
Yeah.
But in a lot of their other big wins, their defense has stepped up and been able to hold their opponent. And, it is really difficult for your defense to always play at that top level every single game because it really is physicality. And you could argue that that's what really kind of wore St. John's down in the end, was just having to depend so much on being physical and so much on out-rebounding the opponent just because, you really couldn't shoot the ball all that well. You do need more of a balance than what St. John's had. I think that was proven just based off of their tournament run. But with that being said, I mean, if Villanova's defense can get to a point where it is in the top 30, Steve, as you said, top 50 in the country, I mean, just think about how much that would have played a difference, especially when you look at their perimeter defense this year, which cost them, especially late in games. So that is a big thing that I think played a role. But also something else, Steve, that I think played a role in this was the fact that Maryland's athletic director, Damon Evans, had left for SMU, on March 21st, and that really opened the door for Willard to, if he wasn't already considering Villanova, which he probably was based on the rumors that we've heard, to really go out and make that a possibility because, under a new AD in Maryland, already he was concerned, as you said earlier, Steve, with his amount of resources. That's a tough situation to be in, especially for a veteran head coach. So he wants to go to somewhere, that has more stability, and even though Villanova, Eric Rodel is just 3 months on the job. I can't imagine what's going through his head right now. You step in, you fire a coach, then you're picking up somebody, and just how much things has changed. In addition, the House settlement coming up with just how the transfer portal opening. It's been a crazy 3 months for Eric Rodel, but I believe that Willard and a lot of the other people. I think the general consensus is that Villanova has the right person in place in Rodel. They have the right administration in place to make this thing work and to pick things up from what has unfortunately dropped off over the past 3 years for multiple different reasons. But I don't think we've talked about enough how Damon Evans leaving Maryland really opened the door. And even though it may have just kind of worked out that way, and maybe it was a coincidence, maybe it wasn't, everything kind of really moved and the dominoes fell once that happened on March 21st. You began to see, Willard come out and make more statements. There was also a situation where, he didn't call into a show, an early morning show where he was supposed to. That may have been because of the time of playing in the
San
tournament.
Francisco.
Yeah, that is tough. But then later on, he was, on a show that same day in the afternoon. And according to Tommy Godden, who, also, I do want to give credit to Tommy because he had put out a statement, I believe a day or two ago, that Kevin Willard was scheduled to meet with Villanova this weekend, and I would assume that was yesterday at some point in time. So he also had a big part in breaking this news as well. But Godden put out on March 25th that, had the kind of the clip of Willard on the Sheehan podcast saying that as of right now, I'm staying, yes. But that quote doesn't really, make you feel all that confident as of right now. It really is kind of, in my opinion, that passive-aggressive switch. So, there was a lot of things that had happened after Evans had left, and I think that played a big role in Willard, being here on the main line.
Yeah, and again, we've sang Willard's praises, how it's a solid hire, but I think
we will get there. Yeah, it's coming.
Yeah,
we'll talk about it.
Yeah, and before we get there, I will say, and I think again, everyone knows this. I'm not breaking news here, but the portal deadline is ridiculous and needs to be moved. It needs to be moved until after the national championship, and there just needs to be, again, in the revenue sharing thing, will make the budgets of schools like a lot more concrete and in place, because right now it is kind of the Wild West with spending and how you get players and things like that. So I think those things will be figured out in the time being, but just, with the portal opening, that incentivizes, again, programs like Villanova to do these negotiations. And credit to Villanova, too, for not, at least on our end, on Eric Rodel's end, we talk about, again, getting Willard, but also, to trying to be as tight-lipped as possible and try to not make this a big thing. I think that's a really good thing to do, because it is awkward, right? It is very awkward, and you don't want to pry a coach away from a job when he's still coaching. But again, you're forced to. There's like 1,000 players in the portal, and sure, guys don't commit right away, but you got to start talking to players. You got to start making your impression, and you got to get a coach in. You got to have the press conference. You got to lay out a vision so that people in the portal are like, ooh, I really want to go there. Like, I like what Coach Willard is talking about, right, when he has the press conference, which presumably, I guess, will be after the Crown. There'll be a little bit of a delay.
Yeah, you would think so, but I think there also is a possibility that it could be this week.
Or before, maybe.
Yes, I wouldn't be surprised, because I know that there is a gap, too, between games. It could be this week, but also, too, you would have to believe that there is a chance that Coach Willard could be out in Las Vegas, at least, meeting people, watching this game.
Yeah.
I don't think that's crazy to think of, but and we will talk about towards the end of the show as well what Coach Nardi had to say the other day at media availability. But Nardi will lead the team into Vegas, of course.
Yeah, that'll be, again, interesting to follow. Villanova plays Tuesday, and we'll touch on that a little bit later on. But for Kevin Willard, and again, something that you brought up as well, and they're valid criticisms where, he doesn't win in the NCAA tournament, but we haven't made the NCAA tournament in 3 years, and this is a guy who's been to the NCAA tournament a lot with Seton Hall. From 2000 onward, they've made the tournament 7 times. 5 of them have been because of Kevin Willard, and I'm saying 6. They won the Big East regular season title in 2020, right before the COVID pandemic shut everything down. So really 6 NCAA tournament appearances with Seton Hall, with a program that again struggled, and he rebuilt from the ground, kind of like Iona. He did a really good job there with a mid-major program. So, and again, in the 20-win season stuff, again, Villanova could certainly use that, because again, with Neptune, it was a chore to hit 20 wins. It felt like that was the ceiling. But again, for Willard, just looking at again his history, he's hit that mark repeatedly. It almost feels like, not the floor, I think that's a little ambitious, like the floor is 20 wins, but it feels like definitely a realistic outcome that you could definitely achieve. And again, you look at the Big East, it's difficult, and it's dependent on, again, your non-conference schedule and how good the conference is that year, but 20 wins usually is the benchmark to just kind of make in the tournament, but sometimes you need a little bit more, especially if your wins aren't that good. So definitely exciting, I think, for Villanova just to get, again, back into the tournament, and that's the first step, right? And it seems like, again, something that he's good at is just getting to the tournament. And you brought up the fact that sometimes in March Madness you kind of just get screwed over. It's the luck of the draw, and that's very true. I believe it was 2016 mentioned it, that it was one of the great Seton Hall teams, top 10 defense. They beat Villanova, who ended up going on to win the national championship. That was the Chris Jenkins buzzer beater year. Seton Hall, they win the Big East postseason tournament, and then they're a 6 seed. They go out to the West Coast. They play Gonzaga as an 11 seed, and they end up losing that game. And it's just one of those things. You go out to the West Coast, you don't have a lot of time, and we're making some excuses for them, sure, but it is one game. It's one game, and we know with basketball, variance is an issue, and Seton Hall, again, I think was the better team compared to Gonzaga, but you just think, again, sometimes the ball doesn't bounce your way, and you can't knock them too hard for it. So basically, just the fact is that he'll probably make the tournament soon, again, and we'll see how the roster builds over the course of this next year, but you expect, again, a quick return to the tournament, and then over time, hopefully, he starts to figure out, again, how to make it consistently out of the first weekend, and then really start making a run. But people talking about, oh, he doesn't win in the NCAA tournament, I think some people are still stuck in that like Jay Wright view, where you're comparing the national championships and the Final Fours, and you see Kevin Willard, and he doesn't look as great compared to that. But comparing it to Neptune, it's much better. So I think it is again a good hire, I think, from that perspective as well.
Yeah, I think for Villanova, it is a lot about making the tournament. I mean, you could argue that if Coach Neptune and Villanova had found a way to get into the tournament this year, that Coach Neptune is still the coach. Kyle Neptune is still the coach of this team. You can make a fair argument that Villanova would have kept him here at least for one more season. So, with that being said, I think that Villanova, they want to get back to the tournament. That is really important, and I think that Kevin Willard is the right guy to at least make an even better attempt than they have the past few years. So we'll see what happens. Coming up, we'll find out more, of course, with the transfer portal over the next couple weeks. We'll take a break here on Villanova Sports Talk. When we come back, we do have a statement from Father Peter and Eric Grodell that we'll talk about here on Villanova Sports Talk. We'll also break down kind of the cons to Kevin Willard. We'll talk about some of the media things that he has said that probably don't fit all that well here on Villanova. We'll talk about that and all much more coming up here on Villanova Sports Talk. You're listening to WXVU, V89.1, The Roar.